Good morning, everybody. This is Kyle Bellikopitsky. I'm our Executive Director of New York State Parent Teacher Association, and I am so thrilled this morning to bring you this presentation, Courageous Conversations in Diversity and Inclusion. This is one of our spotlight presentations, which means that you are all home watching this together. We're really excited, and we would like you to comment in that chat box as we move forward with our wonderful speakers and presenters today. First off, I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Leslie Myers Small. Dr. Small has been a 30-year career educator that actually began as a counselor in the Rochester City School District. She served in a number of school districts over her tenure, recently as Assistant Commissioner for the Office of Innovation and School Reform, and now she serves as the Superintendent of the Rochester City School District. So Dr. Myers Small, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
And Dr. Oliver Robinson is no stranger to New York State PTA as well. He has been a speaker at a number of our diversity, inclusion, and outreach events. Dr. Oliver Robinson, again, a long-tenured superintendent with Mohannisan and Shenendahowa school districts, served on the TRS board, has served with PTA, and has a number of PTAs in his school district of Shenendahowa Central School District here in the Capital Region. So Dr. Robinson, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Kyle.
And it's very exciting because we're talking to both true published authors on many leadership strategies. So we're really welcome to have you. And then representing our New York State PTA is our current treasurer and designated officer for leadership development, Patty Frazier. Patty, thanks for being our moderator tonight.
It's my pleasure.
And Patty, we're going to jump right in. So during this conversation, we're going to have a collaborative conversation of something that's so important for us at New York State PTA, diversity, inclusion, and outreach, and really that communication, what happens between school leaders and PTA leaders on this very, very critical issue facing our schools. We are so proud that we have a standing committee on diversity, inclusion, and outreach, that we have supporting new initiatives each and every day. Through that committee, we actually just started a new Facebook group on diversity, inclusion. So please check that out. We'll put that in the chat as well. And Patty, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you so much, Kyle. At New York State PTA, we like to model what we're doing as examples of what our local PTA units can be doing. So as Kyle mentioned, we have had established a standing committee on diversity and inclusion and outreach. So what I'd like to ask from both of you today is, what can our local PTAs do now to advocate for their district to establish a diversity and inclusion committee or task force?
So I can start. So again, thank you for the opportunity. I think the place that we start from is that why aren't we doing this? And that we're really at a critical juncture. When we look at contemporarily what has happened just over the past few months, given what happened relative to the murder of George Floyd and just numerous other Black and brown individuals that have had issues that have resulted very poorly as relative to interactions with law enforcement. We've seen the contemporary environment. Again, I don't want to get into politics, but what has been created, we definitely have a race issue in the United States of America. And so certainly what better place to talk about diversity and inclusion is in our pre-K through 12 institutions. We are the leaders. We should be modeling and exempling and be the example makers for this. And so it really is not a matter of this is something nice to have, or maybe we should think about it. This really is critical given where we are relative to diversity, inclusion, race relations, et cetera.
And I would concur with Leslie's Dr. Myers Small, we're friends, so we have a tendency to go to first names, comments. And I would say one of the things that local PTAs, starting the conversations are important, because oftentimes people function in a very silo role. So in other words, PTA people kind of only talk to PTAs, and when you start to look at PTAs, one of the big issues is how we even diversify PTA. You get certain group think. So while people may think that their lived experience is the lived experience of the entire school district, it really isn't. And so I think by broaching the conversation from that perspective, with a recognition that as a parent group that's there to support the benefit of all students, that conversation needs to start from that perspective and asking the question, are we truly meeting and supporting the needs of all students? And consequently, what else can we as parents who can advocate for things do within our communities?
Thank you. Really wonderful direction for us to go for our PTA units. In our schools right now, what do you find is the biggest challenge for inclusivity that we are facing? And again, from a perspective of the PTA, how can we help to support our communities and our schools becoming more inclusive?
There's a few challenges I'll note, but certainly they're not limited to what I'm going to share. I think first and foremost, there's just, in some instances, there's a lack of knowledge or information. I'm big on definition of terms and making sure we understand what does diversity actually mean? What does inclusion mean? And so if you don't have experience with it, and Dr. Robinson, I almost said Oliver, Dr. Robinson noted this, that, you know, we have to have conversations, right? And it often becomes the elephant in the room, similar to talking about politics, right? That we just don't want to talk about diversity. We don't want to talk about inclusion because it ends up in a Hatfield and McCoy debate. But I also feel that there's sometimes a fear that somehow or other groups that have been typically marginalized now get all of this stuff, and whatever that stuff is, if it's resources or if it's time and attention. And again, I have to reiterate the importance of contemporarily what we're going through, that we have to make sure as our schools are inclusive. The demographics are rapidly changing, particularly in predominantly white school districts. They're becoming more Black and brown if we're talking about race, but the socioeconomic landscape is changing. Students who don't speak English or families who don't speak English as their first language. So it's not a matter of if we should do this, but really when. And so the PTSA is certainly a critical partner in helping. They're the parents of the children in our schools, the scholars in our schools. So working with the superintendent, articulating concerns, needs, the need for this with the Board of Education are all places and touch points that the local PTSA chapters can help with.
Just to piggyback a little bit on Dr. Meyer's small comment, absolutely. There's unfortunately so many terms that are used interchangeable, for example, that not only are incorrect, but change the context of conversations so much so that you have people thinking that they're working towards the right thing. And in many cases, they're perpetuating the thing that they thought they were working against. So I think that term definition becomes important. And it's important for a couple of reasons. Recognize that people come to these conversations at different points with different exposures, different even value systems that ultimately drive what they can embrace and when they can embrace certain things. So I think what a big part of with PTAs is then start talking about what are we really talking about here? I mean, when we start talking about diversity and inclusivity, what does that actually look like in our schools? What does that smell like? What does that feel like? What are we really trying to address? What's that authentic experience that we want our students to have? And again, asking those questions, is that happening? Is it that vibrant, dynamic, life-changing, positive experience that all students are having, or is it just only some students? And so it becomes a question of PTAs asking themselves, are we going to take the traditional approach to things that, quite frankly, perpetuates only the status quo? Now, are we going to be much more progressive in our thinking, recognizing that we also have to they have to give themselves permission to fail forward, recognizing that you will say things, do things that for the first time, it'll be an awakening to say, wow, did not realize that was meant by that or this by that. And I think that's part of the issue is that people try to be so safe in conversations that they end up not doing anything that's worthwhile. And so when you think about the times that we're in, and these are wonderful times that we're in, by the way. These are the times that certainly my first time in 26 years in education, all of it administration in New York, that people are really, really starting to ask themselves, what is this whole school thing about? And are we truly meeting the needs of all our kids? consequently, the conversations with our PTAs, again, the reason why the PTAs become so important, because they're the parents, they're the voices on Facebook, you know, and Facebook and social media chatter. They're the people that's creating the buzz outside the walls of schools. And so how do we ensure then that the buzz that's being created outside the walls of our schools are also consistent with the vision, mission, and goals of our schools in terms of being a very intentional, very deliberate in providing learning environments that embrace the totality of every student, of each and every student. So that's why that conversation and term definition becomes important, and not just make assumptions about what terms mean, but also then listening more so than talking. So I think this has to be an exercise where people just need to have a safe environment to come and share perspective, with the objective of growing and learning. Not necessarily I have all the answers and I'm therefore, no, it's a perspective. I'm coming to this conversation to learn from this conversation, to grow from this conversation, to ultimately be a contributor to the larger mission of providing, again, that learning environment that embraces the totality of each individual student.
Thank you for those responses. And that kind of leads us into a direction where an issue that we're seeing that's being talked about quite a bit in our school districts. And that really is what can we, as now New York State PTA, working with our local units, do as an association to advocate for more diverse staffing in our school districts? And what can we do to support whatever efforts or encourage those efforts with our school district superintendents and Board of Educations?
Great. So one of my favorite sayings goes like this. It says, "It's hard to be it if you can't see it." And so I think about my educational experience, and I'm focusing on race for just a moment. The first time that I had a teacher of color was actually a professor of color, and it's when I went off to college. So pre-kindergarten through 12th grade, I never had a teacher who looked like me. And so that's really important, right? Whether it's race, whether it's gender. And so as I think about the direction that we are headed in the Rochester City School District, we are a 90% plus African-American, Black, Latinx district. So our goal, we feel that we've achieved true equity when our teaching force in particular reflects the racial demographic of our students. But we know that there are areas that either gender becomes a problem, race is an issue, there's not representation. So I think the very first step is to know exactly what are your numbers and not just do a visual scan and say, well, that person looks like they're female or that person looks like they're African American or, fill in the blank. So knowing what your numbers coupled with what your percentages are of the diversity. And again, you have to define what does diversity mean in your school district, in your school community. And so as we think about what can the PTA do to help with that, it's participating in work sessions when the board is addressing that. More times than not, there's a board subcommittee that focuses on human resources, or there's at least an update to the general session about where are we with our numbers. And this is becoming much more common for districts to talk about this. Where it gets difficult, however, is because you have the argument that, you can't hire based on, and again, fill in the blank. But we are being very purposeful in Rochester about really making sure that we do diversify the ranks. And it's not just the teaching ranks, it's the school administrative ranks, it's on the district level, and it's all in between. But for far too long, we have certain groups that certain races or ethnicities dominate, right, as far as filling those roles, and others are very minimal or absent. So just calling the question and just knowing where we start, and then setting goals and targets to say, here's our 3-year plan or our 5-year plan from now. We're going to be very actively recruiting and going and looking in places that maybe we typically haven't looked before. That has to be a focus and an emphasis of the district. And so parents, caregivers are partners to help us take a look at that and give us some support moving. We have usually an assistant superintendent, and then we have other HR professionals, but there are parents and caregivers who have that expertise. I know I have many in Rochester that can help us develop plans and take active steps to move forward to actualize that in our school communities.
And again, I think it should make sense that Dr. Myers and I agree in many ways, because we're living the experience of leading systems and trying to achieve the things that your questions point to. And so when we think about diversifying staff, the first thing actually comes to my mind is not necessarily people. First thing I think about is the organizational culture, because the culture of the organization speaks to not only who's included, but who's ignored, who's left out. And so when PTAs and other organizations, in this case, really started thinking about what's even the demographics of the PTA itself, because if you have a PTA that's not very diverse, it's hard for them to say, how can we contribute to that? So I think one of the first things with that is, how can a PTA be much more intentional and reach out to various populations within the respective communities in a very intentional way, with a very explicit piece. We want the representation of our school community in our PTAs. Consequently, when we have opportunities to influence or be a part of hiring processes, we want to ensure that those hiring processes have a representatives of the respective groups within the school community. So I think all that then speaks to a culture, not only the culture of the school district, but a culture of the school community. And so these conversations, and I'm glad you asked this question, because these conversations go more than just having a workshop on diversity and equity. These conversation goes into, what's the value construct of this community? Is this a community that fundamentally believe that it should represent and meet the needs of all students? Or is it a community that's satisfied with the current situation, the current status quo, that meets the need of whatever that mainstream is in that community? So those are real fundamental questions to be asked and answered. And those are great community conversations that PTAs can have, because there's a big difference. I, as superintendent, and I have community conversations now, I bring the topics up. People engage in them, but they engage them with some degree of caution, right? Because they're trying to figure out where that goes, versus from a parent to parent to saying, here's what we see as a value area that we need to discuss and work through. Then that community becomes much more attractive for people who are looking to go to work in the community. If the signals and the vibes from a particular community is that, sorry, we kind of like it the way it is, guess what? You're not going to get anyone else to even entertain the idea of applying, much less working there. So I know that we work hard trying to ensure that the narrative, the message that's given to anyone is, this is a place that we want people to come because we want people to come and thrive in. And subsequently, PTAs have a tremendous opportunity to contribute to that narrative, to that conversation.
So just to take that a step further, we talked a little bit about like a 3 to 5 year plan of what we would want our districts to do. As parents, the majority of us participating in the association, we have hopefully the ears of our children. What can we be doing with our children to encourage them to consider education as the field where they would be able to build their career, to bring, again, a sense of what the community intentionally looks like, to now taking on those careers and then joining the field? What can we be doing to encourage them in that direction?
So this is an area that is certainly of interest to me. And we have a great initiative in Western New York, specifically Monroe County. It's entitled Careers in Education. And the focus, it used to be titled Think About Teaching. So it really focused on teaching, and in particularly diversifying the teaching ranks. So it's really a day of professional development where we have a great speaker who comes and rah-rahs the scholars, and then there are workshops. When I took leadership of this organization 7 or 8 years ago, I said education is teaching is a huge component of education, but there is so much more to careers in education, such as support staff, like school counselors or school psychologists. There are administrators, there's principals. Hopefully some of our students aspire to the superintendency, like Dr. Robinson and I did, but there's also folks who work in the transportation department, who are public relations and media. And I don't know about Dr. Robinson, but that's critical in my role right now. So there are so many aspects of education. So again, we provide professional development, try and keep the conversation going to explain the importance of education and why we need our young people to think about joining the ranks. It's very fulfilling. It's one of the few careers that you get to have. Oliver and I are not the CEOs of widgets or of cars or of immaterial things. We're the chief executive officers of children and people, scholars, and living tangible human beings. I can't tell you how rewarding. It's tiring, it's a lot of work, but it is very fulfilling. And I think we miss that sometimes of really sharing that it is a very fulfilling role. It is impactful, and it's just like that drop that goes into the water and then it has that ripple effect that we talk about. It's one of the few fields where you can have an impact. So I think certainly having conversations with the PTA about just even encouraging our parents and caregivers of having good conversations with their children, because often, at least when I was growing up, Leslie, what do you want to be when you grow up? Do you want to be a doctor? Do you want to be a lawyer, right? Education never came across the table between my parents and myself. So making sure as parents that we know the wide array of opportunities that are available, and just making sure that education is one of those options that we share as a possibility, or just to even solicit interest. You okay there?
Yes, I just had a bee or something.
I saw.
And so here we are, nothing like doing live stream conversations, right? And then Mother Nature decided to interrupt. However, I just want to, I'm going to start off with a quote, and I hope that those listening don't necessarily take offense by it, because it's not meant to criticize parents, because I myself is a parent of 3 kids. But there's an old adage that says that children are victims of their parents' craziness. And I would firmly believe that all 3 of my kids are victims of my craziness as well. And I say that because on the other side of that, it speaks to the tremendous influence that parents do have on their children. And not only how they view themselves, but how they view their career options and what they see as areas that they can contribute to the larger community. And so when you think about that in schools, we're often talking about student empowerment, trying to foster a sense of agency in our students. And so that speaks to how do we have students feel empowered to define themselves in terms of who they are, feel empowered to define themselves in terms of where they're going with their education, and students feel empowered to define themselves in terms of how they see their broader responsibilities in the community as a whole. And I think those are great conversations that parents and PTA organizations can help to facilitate, because when you think about what schools are, and Dr. Myers put it very eloquently, we're really molding minds and shaping the futures of young people. And so we're generation builders. When you think about that in that sense of it, the role of PTA, the role of parents is so critical. And we often say that parents are their children's first teachers. And yes, that is so absolutely true, because the messaging that's given, as well as the messaging that's reinforced, parents play a vital role in that. And so as school administrators and school leaders, we have to rely on parents being truly partners in the work of progress. And so that's an opportunity that quite frankly should be engendered more, because if PTAs want to do the first 2 things we've been talking about, focus on diversity and inclusivity, focus on creating environments where we can diversify staff to be much more reflective of our student population. It also speaks to the conversations that people are having at their dinner tables, the things that we force kids to have uncomfortable conversations about things that we may not be comfortable with. And I think that's important, but it's not uncomfortable conversations as criticism. It's uncomfortable conversation to unpack and enhance our knowledge about topics and subject areas. And I often see it now where I get calls from parents that, hey, a teacher was saying this in class, and it becomes a point of protest versus, hold on, stop for a second. Did you ever ask your child, how did he or she feel about that? Why did they feel that way about it? Let's talk about it. And it becomes a growth conversation. And so I think in many ways, we have an opportunity to get out of what has unfortunately been an environment of debate and go into an environment of dialogue. How do we start having real dialogue with our students, with our children? And I can even say personally as a parent, I give a lot of the credit to my wife. She has, since my children were little, I used to call adult conversations. The terms that she used, my 3, 4, 5-year-old kids were using terms that many adults didn't even know, and constructs they didn't know, because my wife saw that as an opportunity to really open my kids' eyes to the world. And so how do we start doing that? That's a tremendous part of it. So we have more young people seeing that coming back and working for their schools and being a part of the education is in fact a moral imperative. And we need not only high technically skilled people, we need high value people. People that come with a high level of character that quite frankly with you transcends all these barriers that unfortunately have been put in the way, be it racial barriers, economic barriers, that transcend all those things, because you create a sanctuary for our kids to be learners.
So kind of segueing in just to take the conversation just a little bit of a different direction, but certainly touching on some of the items that you just brought up. How can our local PTAs help to ensure schools are safe places for all students, and especially those who identify with the LGBTQ community?
So many years ago, I was working in another district and I received a frantic call from the principal. I was an assistant superintendent, and the call was that there were issues with the parent, and they asked if I could come to the school and attend the meeting. The background information was that this child was a kindergartner and the child was identifying as gender fluid. So born a particular gender, but throughout the day or different days fluctuated back and forth between male and female. And the issue was that typically this happens quite a bit in elementary classroom. The teacher innocently said, I want all my girls to line up on this side, and I want all my little boys to line up on this side. And this youngster that day was really conflicted and just broke out into tears because they didn't know which line to get into because they identified with both. And so what was culminating, or what was brewing, was that the student was born male and wanted to wear a sparkly pink dress. And the teacher was concerned about some disruption and whatnot. What was so powerful about the exchange, the parents, mom and dad came in with the principal, myself, and we had a great conversation. And it was partnering with the parent that helped us to move forward. We were able to, that was something, this was many years ago, so I wasn't knowledgeable about gender fluidity like I am now. But it was the parents who brokered and helped to educate us about what their child was going through, the conversations that they were having at home. And they actually bought me a book, a children's book that helped to explain it in very developmentally appropriate ways. That a book that could be read in the classroom to kind of start to warm up the class to the idea that this young person wanted to come to school in a dress. And I remember that story. I'm reminded of it often when I think of gender fluidity, because it was the power of the parents who really advocated for their child and said, you know what, this is important to our son, our daughter, and we really are advocating for this. And so that really initiated change. And we did work with the PTA to have conversations because some parents were very supportive and other parents were livid and didn't want any parts of it, and they didn't want their children in the classroom. But we launched that understanding and that advocacy, and moving forward, that was all through the parents advocating for their child. And I think it's just a really good example of how that played out with really supporting. I would say back then it was the unique needs, but not anymore, the specific needs of their child.
So first reaction was, and it's, thank goodness Dr. Myers went first, so I had a chance to collect my thoughts a little bit. And I probably still going to face, first reaction is that PTAs need to make sure that they're not contributing to the drama. And that's so important when something, and especially now, I see it. Facebook becomes we have a 518 people get together and put all sorts of things on the Facebook, and many of are unsubstantiated. It's people's opinion that if you say it enough time, people think it's the fact. And when the facts go out, you say, no, somebody's lying. So the part of it is PTA could be a real resource for those kind of engagement. So when topics come up, particular topics that that people have varied opinions on, be a resource to have a true measured, controlled conversation focused on awareness building. And from that, we go a conversation where we talk about how do we ensure that every child feels comfortable within our school environment, because ultimately that's the end goal. And so I think that's the one thing PTAs need to look at, because when you think about it, we talking about sexual preferences, gender differences. You could talk about racial differences. You talk about socioeconomic. You could put whatever the category in there. At the end of the day, all those things are intrinsic to the identities and the lived experiences of our students. And so I always say that, at the end of the day, every parent, or we hope every parent love their child, right? And they want to have their child in an environment where their child can be embraced by those who are charged to provide that. And so not contributing to the drama, but instead creating opportunities to have real conversations. Unfortunately, we don't have real conversations. People share bits and pieces of information and draw conclusions and tell themselves a fantastic story, and that fantastic story becomes their reality. So these are great opportunities for PTAs to say, you know what, we want to be able to have community conversations and community circles around various topics, and have honest conversations and create the environment where the conversations can be honest.
Thank you for that. We are having this great conversation here digitally. I'm here in Western New York, like Dr. Leslie Myers-Small. I'm way over here closer to Buffalo though. And I hope you in the Albany area and Rochester are enjoying this beautiful weather today. So we have the advantage of having this wonderful access to technology. What actions can New York State PTA do to implement and ensure equity in digital access for all of our students?
That's a wonderful question, especially given that remote learning has to be an option for students, given the fact that we're in the middle of the pandemic. All I can think about in response to this question is advocacy, advocacy, advocacy. Overall, we're finding that it's not really the device, whether it's an iPad or a Chromebook or a laptop, that's the issue. It's the connectivity that has become the issue. The MiFi devices, Wi-Fi, that has become problematic. And we have had so much philanthropy that is very positively overwhelming for us here in Rochester. But we need advocacy on making internet access affordable or free, as some of my girlfriends say, free 99, no cost to it. And so we need the New York State PTA to advocate that it has become, COVID-19 has shed light on many inequities that many of us have known for a long time, but others have become enlightened as a result of it. The digital divide is certainly one that has been illuminated as a result of the pandemic. So making sure that our students are able to connect their device, that they're able to stay on Zoom for the entire time, that they can download the videos or other assignments when they are asynchronously learning, I think has been so critical for us. And that's where we are. We continue to advocate, but when you have a state organization approaching elected officials, for-profit corporations, right? The holders of the internet access, that is so powerful. And that is something that as a superintendent leading an urban school district is so critical for us to continue to make sure that our students are not disadvantaged because they can't connect their laptop or their device to the internet.
And absolutely, access and availability and reliability, all those things that Dr. Small has mentioned are absolutely critical. And, and I think that sometimes people don't realize there's superpowers, right? So there's nothing like the power of mom. That's what I grew up as a kid, that, your mom look at you a certain way. She doesn't have to say a single word. You know exactly what she means and why she means it. That's a superpower. And so let me take this to the next level. What I mean by this, parents and people who are, and I'm not implying that only women are in PTA, by the way, only implying that my mom had that superpower that she knew she had. And as a parent, you all have that superpower, male, female, or otherwise. What I mean by that superpower is that you are consumers within your communities. And so you have the benefit of using that power with other, be it private sector entities, to say, guess what? Our students, our children need this within our communities. And in order for us to be a vibrant community, be it from an economic development perspective or whatever, we need you to partner to also help do the same thing that Dr. Myers said, to advocate. I got to tell you, politicians listen when they realize that, one, money and votes are on the line. And that's where decisions are made. And so it's not only about PTA members lobbying, be it virtually or otherwise, it's about PTA members demanding within their communities to bring business partners together, say, hey, we come to your businesses every day. We need you to be partners with us on this critical issue. So that's on one side of it, the advocacy side of it. The second side of it is PTA is a volunteer organization. We have PTAs who, right now, their volunteerism within schools are limited, largely limited because of the COVID situation. So how about think about it from the other perspective? How about partnering then with other organizations within communities that have wire access to say, hey, if you have this, your child could come to this community center and we'll have volunteers there to monitor progress throughout the course of the day and do some of those kind of things to build capacity outside of a child's household. And recognizing also we have issues of many parents having to go to work. And so yes, while a child might be home, even having access, the question is that becomes a whole different dilemma in terms of providing the structure. So I think there are many ways that PTAs could contribute to it from a macro perspective. It's sad when you think about, you could go and get free Wi-Fi in parking lots of most businesses, but yet many homes don't have Wi-Fi in them because people can't afford to pay for it. So to me, that's just such a miss. I can't understand the concept. Something that's free, it has to be paid for in order for you to get it in an area that you can more effectively use it. So that's something that has to be addressed. And then we have to think about then, as parents, as members of the community, how do we then look to partner with other organizations that have that access to ensure that our students can go to those places and they're safe places for students to be. They're places that we have adults to be there to ensure to provide supports or otherwise, so students can actually have a great learning environment when they're learning in a virtual space.
And Patty, it's Kyle. I'm going to jump in here. I am so sorry to tell us we are really over our time, but the conversation was so good, I didn't want to jump in. So I just wanted to see if Dr. Robinson or Dr. Myers-Small or Patty, you had any kind of closing comments, and then thank everybody for tuning in.
I've had the first word, so I'll let Dr. Robinson go first, and then I'll go.
So I think that, I'll just end with this, that education can have a dual purpose. What it does to some kids and what it do for others. And you say, what does that mean? some kids, it does enfranchise, disengage, disparage. For some kids, it do for them, it facilitate opportunities. And I think PTAs need to ask that question of themselves. What are we doing to make sure that what education within their respective communities is doing for kids are the things that we all want and can be proud of? And what can we do to support that?
Dr. Robinson really said it best, simply and plainly, that parents are our child's first teachers. And so what parents are modeling at home, what in word and in deed, are critically important. So as we talk about diversity, as we talk about inclusion, it really first starts at home, and having those courageous conversations when your child comes home and says, hey, this happened. Somebody said an unkind word about my classmate, or I don't understand why this was said on TV, or why I'm seeing this particular person do this or that. And it's so powerful for us to be able, it's an overused phrase, but we need to have those courageous conversations. Both Dr. Robinson and I highly value the collaborative relationship, the symbiotic relationship that exists between the superintendent and parents and the PTA. We are certainly very grateful for this opportunity. We thank you for asking us to talk about a topic that is very near and dear to both of our hearts. And certainly we are available should you have questions or need to get some things jump-started in your school communities. This is courageous work, but we're doing this for the benefit of the children, and so it's worthwhile work. Thank you.
And I would like to thank you both for joining us today. I think one of the things that we as New York State PTA recognize is we have much work to do, especially in the area of diversity and inclusion. We recognize that, and we are really trying many different avenues to really model the best behavior that we can at the state level for our local units. And so we appreciate you joining us today to help us along our path, because we do need the help. And so we certainly do appreciate it. And we thank you for your partnership with parents. It means everything to us. It is our belief, as it is your belief, that our parents are the child's first educator and really the influence on their life and their future. And so we, again, appreciate you being along for the ride with us. And the conversation,
on behalf of our president, Jane Harsha, thank you to the three of you for providing such a fantastic panel for our conference attendees. We know we will continue to work with you in the future. Have a nice day, everybody.